Hello, and thank you again for joining us. Today is June 6th, 2018, and today's webinar will be IBM Maximo Spatial, GIS and Mobility. It looks like a great session today. We look forward to reviewing how Spatial extends to IBM Mobile, how ESRI and Maximo communicate, how to get your GIS ready for Spatial, and more tips and tricks. My name is Alex Duggan, and I will be your MC today. I am Senior Project Manager with LMI 360, a sales and marketing organization focused on service and technology providers that support the commercial built environment. In short, we help your company grow. Joining us today is Amy Tatum, Vice President of Starboard Consulting. Amy has over 25 years of experience as an engineer and technology consultant and has managed the implementation of countless Maximo projects. Amy was also the featured presenter for our May 15th webinar, How to Survive Maximo 7.5 End of Service. Just in case you missed that webinar and the great information that Amy shared, we'll be including a link with the follow-up. Our presenter today is top-rated Maximo application developer Butch Burlman with Starboard Consulting. Butch has vast experience and specializes in all things Maximo. He's known for creating simple yet elegant solutions to complex problems. He also has a great sense of humor and is a self-proclaimed EAM nerd. At this time, let's turn it over to Amy, who's live from a client site. Amy, welcome, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks Alex. Welcome everybody. We're glad that you're here with us today and hope that you find the next hour to be very informative and useful. And if you have any follow-up questions afterwards, as Alex said, we'll try to get to most of those during the Q&A at the end of the session, but you can always reach out to Starboard Consulting after the fact, and we'd be happy to work with you to get any additional questions answered. A little bit about me. I am co-founder and VP of Starboard. I've been working for over 20 years as an engineer and technology consultant, and my background is actually electrical engineering. I'm from Georgia Tech with a start in power systems, which got me into the utility sector, which then led to IT and the control center, and then to Maximo with a consulting group. So I've been around the utility industry specifically for a long, long time, but then working with Maximo for about 20 years now. A little bit about Starboard Consulting and who we are. We are a premier IBM business partner. Have been implementing Maximo and only Maximo for our clients, along with any third-party solutions and add-on solutions that IBM offers. We create partnerships with our client and trying to build a team and a long-lasting relationship to make sure that you get out of your Maximo everything that you need from it. The services that we offer include assessments and implementations, upgrades, configurations, data migration, training, post-implementation support, pretty much anything and everything that you might need related to your Maximo implementation. Then we have skilled and certified resources on staff that are able to do that. As Alex mentioned, our featured speaker today is Butch Burlman, and I'm going to turn it over to Butch to tell you a little bit more about himself and then get started with the real good information of our webinar today.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited that you all took time out of your day to give me an opportunity and Starboard to reach out and talk to you about Maximo Spatial 7.6. A little background on me. I've been doing GIS and EAM work for about 15 plus years. I was a Maximo and a GIS developer in a Forest Service utility. I've also consulted in both the GIS and Maximo industries. And I'm a self-described spatial EAM nerd. Maximo and GIS are extremely powerful systems, and they help decision makers make really difficult decisions. And bringing those systems together creates a special synergy that is extremely powerful and really has moved me throughout my entire career. And that's really the big reason why I'm so excited to have an opportunity to talk to you today about Maximo Spatial 7.6. All right, so before we get started, we're going to kick off a quick poll, and I'm going to hand it over to our chairperson to manage that.
Thanks, Butch. So if you could just go ahead and tell us what mapping interface are you using with Maximo? We would love to hear from you. If you want to go ahead, and I can see the results coming in. Looks like a lot of people are on 7.6, which is great. A lot of people haven't connected yet, which is good too. Looks like we have a few more responses coming in. We'll give it just a few more seconds if you want to tell us where you're at. Great. So looks like you're between no mapping and 7.6. What do you think, Butch?
Sounds great. Sounds like we have a perfect audience for today. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our agenda a little bit. So first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about how ESRI and Maximo communicate. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the 7.6 user experience improvements. And because this webinar is really geared towards administrators and folks that are looking to implement Maximo Spatial 7.6, or maybe folks that already have it and are looking to try maybe get a little bit more out of what they've already invested in, the interface conversation is going to be mainly focused around administrative components. But there are a lot of changes in the end user UI. Then we're going to talk a little bit about getting your GIS ready for spatial. So I was looking at the folks that signed up for the webinar, and I noticed a few GISer names. I know we also have lots of Maximo folks. So if you're a GISer and you're trying to kind of understand a little bit about this Maximo Spatial 7.6 thing you've been hearing about, we're going to give you a couple things to walk away with. Also, if you're an EAM person and you need to go back and have a conversation with your GISers, we're going to give you a couple bulleted items to start talking with them about what you're going to be kind of maybe hoping to get. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how spatial extends into IBM Mobile. And then finally, we're going to talk about tips and tricks. And there's going to be a little bit in here for everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple things that project managers are going to be concerned about and interested in, a couple things that functional folks are going to be really interested in, and of course, a few things that techie people are going to definitely love. All right, so first thing is how ESRI and Maximo communicate. So we titled this slide circa 2000. When I first started getting involved with EAM systems and GIS, this is kind of what the integration would look like. In this particular example, we've got Maximo on one side and our ESRI systems on the other. In this particular example, we also didn't have Maximo Spatial at the time, so all of this would have been largely homegrown development effort going on. Our SQL database is managing the connections of the data between both systems, so we've got duplicate SQL packages in there that are managing that data replication and syncing. Since we're using a relational database system, we've got a product called ArcSDE in there, and that's how you'd store your spatial data in a relational database. And then we've got end users with ArcGIS Desktop that are connecting to ArcSDE to view that data. And if you wanted to publish your data via a web mapping interface, you were using a product called ArcIMS at the time. And in some environments, clients would go ahead and they'd actually build a mapping application that would allow that IMS-based web map to be brought into Maximo and kind of replicating what we're able to accomplish today with the Maximo Spatial 7.6 product. But again, that's all homegrown. So now we're going to jump forward a little bit, and I'm sure a lot of folks are probably familiar with this, Maximo Spatial 7.5. You'll notice that things have changed quite a bit, and we've lost a couple of the big images that we had and a few of the arrows and lines going back and forth. So starting on the GIS side, ArcIMS was replaced with a product called ArcGIS Server. And as part of replacing that, they also consolidated ArcSDE into the ArcGIS Server product. I'll never forget one of the early ESRI developer conferences that I went to when ESRI had just recently announced that they were going to actually allow you to use or make available the functionality of REST interfaces for GIS integrations. And it was funny because you could always tell the sessions where they were talking about the REST interface because also at the time blogging had become very popular and everybody had a blog. So developers would go into the conference, they'd learn all these things, and then they'd come out and they'd just line up out in front of the doors of the conference room with their laptops and they'd be just typing away, writing up their blog to share all the information that they just learned. And I think that that is kind of evident of, at the time, people knew that that was going to be the future. They knew the impact that was coming. And Spatial 6 now is that future day. The last thing I want to touch on this, though, is that we've got our web mapping applications. Our web maps are being provided through the REST interface, but the SQL, the database connection, is still what's managing that data connection between both systems. All right, and so today we're at Maximo Spatial 7.6, and things have gotten a lot simpler. Our footprint's a lot smaller, and now we're leveraging the REST interface for not only providing that web mapping interaction in Maximo, but also for managing the data linkages between both systems. So if you're not too familiar with REST, this is the Wikipedia definition, and I'm not going to read it to you, but another way I like to describe REST, if you're not familiar with it, is it's using the same technology you use every day to surf the web, but we're using it in a way that allows us to integrate our GIS and EAM systems together. So there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of robustness, and there's a lot of value add that comes from leveraging things that we already invested in. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the 7.6 user experience improvements. So there's a term that we've kind of coined at Starboard when we're starting to get folks involved with Maximo Spatial 7.6, and we call it the spatial flow. And the spatial flow represents a series of applications that you use as you're going through the configuration process of Maximo Spatial. The first application in that list is Map Manager. And this is where we configure our map services, security, quite a few other things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in greater detail. But once we have those things defined, once we know we have assets and we know we have feature classes that we want to bring into Maximo, we need to figure out how to translate that between both systems. That's where our JSON mappings come into play. So we're going to talk about that after we get done talking about Map Manager. And finally, in some circumstances, we're going to actually want GIS to create, we want GIS features to create objects inside Maximo, so assets, locations, work orders, service addresses, things like that. So in that particular case, we're going to need something that will reach out into the GIS and get the data that we need and bring it over into Maximo so that we can create those objects. And in that case, we're going to use the CRON. So we're going to talk about that finally, and that concludes the spatial flow. So Map Manager is an application that has a lot of functionality in it, and there's a lot of configuration options. There's a lot of power in that application. And when we started to figure out what we wanted to talk about with Map Manager application, we kind of settled on a few key things that we feel are really important to just get a baseline implementation in place with Maximo Spatial. So let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit more, but we've got a few screenshots that I hope will kind of bridge all the gaps together. So when we first create a Map Manager record, we have a couple options. A couple key things to note here is that we can provide a description of our Map Manager record. We can identify the measurement units. We can also enable the map. We can also configure the map to be used for particular sites within our Maximo implementation. And beyond that, we can identify a zoom level and an XY that we want the initial extent to zoom into. So if you're in an organization that has a really large footprint, or you're in an organization that has a really small one, like regionally, you can use the same map and configure it for each one of your different sites and get a distinctly tailored experience for each one of them. All right, we also configure security inside the Map Manager application. So you can see here we have a place where we can configure OAuth 2 security along with token security. So one of the things that you can't configure in Map Manager is SSL certification or SSL configuration. A large percentage of that still needs to happen with inside WebSphere, which is or whatever middleware technology you're using at the time, or using to host your Maximo environment. And as you've imagined, or probably concluded, I can't talk about OAuth 2 security without also mentioning web maps. Maximo Spatial does support web map application or web maps. So that means that we can bring web maps in from ArcGIS Online and use them inside Maximo Spatial. If you're also coming into the webinar and kind of wondering, maybe you're a GISer and you know utility networks on the front, and you're kind of wondering how Maximo Spatial is going to fit into your utility network roadmap, the answer is quite well. And IBM's actually thinking of you as they're going through their product development, and making portal maps available inside Map Manager is just one more example of that. Incidentally, we've actually used ArcGIS Online for a couple Maximo Spatials configurations, and it's pretty neat and pretty powerful to think that we can take a cloud-based mapping application and bundle it with a really powerful EAM system. We're really, really excited about all the potential opportunity that can come from that.
And that can generate a completely cloud-based solution, because Maximo, of course, also can be a cloud-based SaaS or MaaS model option for you as well if you don't have the IT support staff or just have other reasons to not want to have the on-premise solutions.
That's a great point, Amy. Thank you for mentioning that. So this is a little deeper into our Map Manager configuration. So you can see here now we're starting to see URLs that are based, or URLs for accessing the REST endpoints in our Maximo, or I'm sorry, in our GIS configuration. You can also see here that we can configure an order, transparency, and a visibility. So you can see, based on the view extents and based on this, there is a bit of configuration that we can actually do that's pretty map focused inside Maximo Spatial to tailor the user experience. You know, a lot of folks will say, well, gosh, we have a web mapping standard in place. It has symbology that's unique to our organization, and that's really the footprint that we want, or that's really the map that we want to use and make available in Maximo Spatial. And we think that's a great idea, and it works extremely well for getting initial orientation. But sometimes, because we're using maps inside Maximo for an EAM tailored experience, additional feature classes may be required. And this just gives us more flexibility to how we want to represent those additional feature classes to the end users. The other thing I want to point out, towards the bottom of the slide, you'll see a circle with service layers. So what's happening down in that area is that's actually where we're configuring the GIS MBO. So the GIS MBO is an in-memory object in Maximo that represents the GIS data as it appears at the REST endpoint. So that's a really powerful concept. Traditionally, what you'd have to do in those types of situations is to replicate that information or find another solution, but at Spatial 7.6, we can actually use the same REST interface that we're using to expose our map data to also bring that data into Maximo so that we can do things like display it on the screen or build automation scripts against it. Extremely powerful. We're going to talk a little bit more about JSON mapping and the translation between the data systems, but inside Map Manager is where we initially configure the individual JSON mappings to the spatial MBOs and the map services that we've got configured. So in this particular example, we can see initially we have an inbound. So for this particular manhole, we have an inbound JSON mapping to translate the GIS data as it comes in from GIS into Maximo. We can also configure a response. So a response is a one-time response, a one-time update back to GIS based on a record that was created. So in this particular circumstance, if we wanted to say create assets inside Maximo for manholes, we could configure everything and then configure our inbound and our out or our response-based mapping. And when a new manhole is created in Maximo, that asset number would be sent back, or some other piece of data would be sent back to GIS and updated one time. If we had additional attribute information that we wanted to, that needed to reside inside Maximo, but also be updated accordingly in GIS in the database, we can configure an outbound JSON mapping, and that will run every time or any time a record is updated inside Maximo. But as you can see here too, we don't necessarily need an outbound mapping when we have an inbound and a response. So a couple of the other features that I want to highlight, again, you can see at the top, we've got several tabs: map tips, advanced settings, and map symbology. We're not going to talk about those things today, but we do want to talk to you a little bit about geocoding services. So if you're an organization that manages your own geocoding service and you'd like to make it available, if you can get it out to your ArcGIS server and publish it there, you can configure it inside Maximo and provide that street level type searching for your Maximo spatial end users. Additionally, if you don't necessarily maintain your own geocoder, but you're up to date on your ESRI licensing, you can use the ESRI geocoder and configure that in Maximo Spatial. And we've actually had a client who had a business case where they required that. We're able to leverage it, and they've had tremendous success with the quality of data that's in that. So it's a very powerful tool, and it's just another example of leveraging the investment you already have and getting more out of it. If you're going to be drawing and creating features inside Maximo, you're going to want to configure a geometry service here. That's nothing more than just enabling in your map services and then configuring it here. And finally, if you want to allow your users to print and export maps from Maximo, you'll need to configure the printing service here as well. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the JSON mapping. So like I've said, the JSON mapping is the translation between GIS and Maximo, how we get that attribute, those attributes to align and translate between both systems. We use it for both inbound and outbound messages coming into Maximo and going out. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And Maximo, or IBM, excuse me, has made available some basic JavaScript type functions inside the JSON mapping. And one of the most important things I think that you can walk away from this webinar with is knowing that JSON mapping is an eloquent, easy solution to a problem that was commonly required complex, expensive code to resolve. And some of the examples of things that we've done at Starboard with JSON mapping are formatting of features. So we had a requirement where a description needed to have a couple additional carriage returns and some bold highlighting in a few areas. We've been able to accomplish that with JSON mapping. Conditional operators. So a feature class is published, but based on one subtype, we want a particular type of description. On another subtype, we want a different type of description. That's something you can do in JSON mapping. And we've also done some basic JavaScript code. So we've done some basic string manipulation using core JavaScript functionality inside JSON mapping. And again, those are the types of things that can be very helpful when you're doing your upfront design of your implementation of Maximo Spatial 7.6, but also if you run into a circumstance where you're late on in the project and you have a business need come up that has maybe a requirement that would traditionally be handled by code or by some more invasive code, but you don't have the time to put that code into place. This can be a really eloquent situation to keep your project online. And for our project managers out there listening, definitely take note of this. We can also provide conditional operators. So if an attribute is null, we can say use a different one for the mapping translation, or we can say, set it to a fixed value of some sort. Finally, asset spec updates. So we can actually update the asset spec information inside Maximo using the JSON mapping. When I first saw this, I was really excited, and I'll share a little story why. One of my initial jobs as a Maximo and GIS developer was to maintain a large PL SQL package that kept hydrant information in sync between Maximo and GIS. And we had a lot of replicated business logic inside that PL SQL package that existed inside Maximo and already existed inside our GIS. And ever so often, an error in that logic would be exposed, and I'd have to go in there and troubleshoot it and pull it all apart and figure out exactly where those little bits and pieces kind of came apart. And it took up a large chunk of time to do that. And when I saw how easy it was to configure that same type of implementation in Maximo, Maximo Spatial 7.6, I got really excited. Well, I'm pleased to report that it is as simple and easy as it looks, and very powerful. So another key feature to take away of the power of JSON mapping. So now we've just got a couple screenshots of JSON mapping. You can see here when we create a new one, we can identify a name and a description. We can identify the direction, whether or not it's coming into Maximo or it's going out. The object structure. So this represents what object in Maximo this GIS feature is going to represent. So in this particular configuration, we're obviously looking at an asset. We have some sort of feature class that's going to be an asset inside Maximo. In the JSON document and JSON data area is where we can either copy and paste a JSON data object from a REST endpoint, or we can provide a URL in the URL area or URL field, and Maximo will go out and grab that data object and populate that for us. So that when we get to the next tab, or the Properties tab, now we've got a little bit more information here that we can configure that's detail specific to our translation. Initially in the JSON object mapping, you can see the data structure of the JSON object that was provided. So in this particular case, there's a hierarchy, the highest being the slash, then slash features, and then features attributes. So we map in the JSON object model, or object mapping, where we get to the point where we have attributes exposed. Then we can go down to the JSON properties mapping at the bottom, and we can identify the fields that are in the Maximo object that we want, and how we want, and what attributes we want from the GIS side to map to that. So you'll notice, for example, on the FAC ID field in Maximo, we see a $facility ID on the source property. So that represents a field in the GIS data that we want to populate into Maximo. You'll notice there's a few spots where we have characters with double quotes, and those are just fixed values that we want to be populated when the records are created inside Maximo. All right, so finally we're going to talk a little bit about the CRON. And again, the CRON is a application that may or may not be in your spatial flow, dependent upon your business case that you're implementing Maximo Spatial for. But we are going to talk about it a little bit because it is quite common. So the first thing about the CRON task is that there's a generic CRON task called ArcGIS Sync. And in there we get a few out-of-the-box CRON task instances. So the way that we go about configuring this is we configure a cron task instance per each GIS MBO that we're configuring for. And when we do that, we have quite a bit of flexibility. We can configure, first of all, the frequency at which that feature class is going to be, the cron task is going to run for that particular feature class or GIS MBO. So this is really powerful. If we have data sets that are quite large and maybe need to be run at off periods of time on the system, we can do that by configuring the schedule. We can also do things like respond to requirements where we have a parent-child relationship that needs to be maintained and make sure that one cron runs before the other. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And if you're familiar with crons at all, you'll be very familiar and comfortable when you come in here to configure this. We also go about configuring an update flag, and I didn't talk about this too much before, but I'll talk about it a little bit now. When we go about configuring Maximo Spatial, we have a list of things that we generally try to get accomplished, or a list of things to note on the GIS side, and one of them is attribution additional attributes that we'd like to have on the GIS feature classes. So in this particular case, if it's a feature class where the data is going to be creating assets or locations or something inside Maximo, we request a field called MX creation state. And we generally request that this field be set to 1 initially when records are identified that need to be coming from GIS into Maximo. So inside the CRON configuration, the way that the CRON works is a URL is defined. I'll talk about that in a minute. That URL is executed by Maximo. The end product of that URL is a data packet that comes into Maximo. The CRON takes that data packet and it puts it and queues it up into the Maximo integration framework. As soon as it does that, it sends a response back to GIS with this processed flag for every record that was in the initial data package to indicate that they've been processed, or at the very least they've been queued up in Maximo to be processed. And this is where we go about configuring what that value will be. Here you can see we have it set to 2, but you can really set it to anything that you'd like. Finally, the URL that I was just mentioning, it's inside the CRON task parameters here was where we configure a URL that represents the query to return the data to be processed into Maximo. So as you can imagine, we just create a REST query with an MX creation where the where clause is MX creation state equal to 1, copy and paste that in here, and that's it. Voila, we're set. And once we've done all of those steps once, we've got a handy-dandy duplicate button. I was really excited when I saw this initially, and as I started configuring more feature classes and more layers, I really appreciated it more and more. It makes it really easy to be able to just come in here, hit duplicate, and change a few things and reproduce or use it as a framework, a CRON task to reproduce additional linked features. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for another poll.
Thanks, Butch. So we'd love to ask real quick, when do you plan to invest in a spatial solution? If you know, 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, farther out, never. We'd love to hear your results. Great, thanks for sharing. Some good results coming in. Looks like a lot of 6 to 12 months or more. Looks like we have a few more responses. We'll give you just a few more seconds. Great. So a lot of 6 to 12 or greater than 12 months. Thanks for participating. Great feedback.
All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about getting your GIS ready for spatial. So the first thing to note is that you're going to need unique identifiers. Now, if you're taking data from Maximo and you're sending it over to GIS, that's going to be pretty easy, because if it's a work order, you have a value like work order number that's unique to a work order inside Maximo that can be used to maintain that relationship between both the systems. If you're bringing data over from GIS into Maximo, you're going to need to add an attribute somewhere that will be unique for that record that can be used as part of this relationship. One thing to note is that integer values are not supported. So if you were thinking about just putting a sequence, for example, in the database and using that, that's not going to work. You're going to need something that's, again, not integer based. We have helped quite a few clients use global IDs, and that's been a very effective tool for managing that relationship, and then uses a unique value for features that are coming over from GIS into Maximo. Additionally, you're going to need feature services, and at the very minimum, you're going to need the ability to update via those feature services. Using the CRON example that we talked about before, at the very minimum, if you're going to be using that CRON to create records inside Maximo, the CRON is going to need to be able to update that MX creation state and set it to 2 so that those records aren't continually sent into Maximo. Additionally, if you want the ability to, say, create features, GIS features inside Maximo on the Map tab, for example, drawing in locations or work orders or SR features, you're going to need the ability to insert those records into GIS as well. Indexing is something that, in that I talked a little bit about a preparation packet that we provide to the GIS folks, and always in that packet is a question around indexing. If you don't have an indexing strategy, we recommend that you look at investing in one or developing one. Maximo and GIS data can put a burden on the database, and a well-tuned, well-indexed database generally responds quite well. So it's just something to note. Finally, we get asked a lot about versioning. Organizations will say we have a versioning strategy in place. We want to make sure that Maximo Spatial will work within that versioning strategy, and the answer to that question is yes. One of the things that we do recommend is that you have some form of automated process in place to manage your versioning strategy. It would be a shame to invest a lot of time, money, and effort in a Maximo Spatial implementation only to have the person who manages your versions nightly be out sick for 2 days, and all of that data stop flowing between systems, or at the very minimum not be available to everybody as it was initially architected. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how spatial extends to IBM Mobile. So when it comes to mobile and GIS, we see a lot of synergies between the Maximo spatial product and the mobile products. As features and enhancements come in both, we see changes in both products. So I think it's great to see that that both of those products are succinct. There's offline and online support for maps. So if you're in an organization that has dead spots in your cellular network and you want to be able to make sure that that data and that mapping data is available, even if the network isn't, there is functionality for that. Redlining capabilities are also available in the mobile product, and that's generally something that a lot of folks are quite interested in. And finally, we can implement maps with both anywhere and every place application application frameworks for mobile. All right, finally we're going to talk a little bit about tips and tricks. So we tried to include something in here for everyone. Again, a little bit for project managers, a little bit for functional folks, and a little bit for our technical folks. All right, the first tip and trick to note is upfront work is key. As you've seen through the slide deck, configuring spatial has gotten very fluid. And it's a few steps to produce a big impact in your configuration. And that's very powerful and very valuable. Unfortunately, those same tools don't exist for removing and reconfiguring the spatial implementation. So if you go about configuring something and then have to redo that work, there's additional time to remove everything, and there's different places where some of that data will be embedded, and so there's a learning process that goes along with that as well. So it's really important that you identify the feature classes that you want to have in the relationship between Maximo and your EAM or your GIS system. It's also important you identify the fields and how those fields will be mapped between both systems up front as much as possible before you start your development effort. Regression testing is also key. We saw a lot of different arrows and boxes drop off of our architectural diagram early on until we got to a point where we had two systems and one line with an arrow in both directions, bringing them both together. So that's very powerful, and it simplifies the integration as a whole, but you still do have two pretty complex systems interfacing and talking together using one line of communication. So it's important to have a strategy in place to regression test that single line of communication to make sure that everything's functioning as you expect. Oftentimes when we come in to do Maximo Spatial implementations, there's other active GIS projects that are going on. And there might be a big release of a bunch of GIS changes, and we get asked, can you verify that all the Maximo Spatial endpoints are functioning correctly? At Starboard, we have templates in place that we use for all of our projects that allow us to redo that or to perform that regression testing very quickly. I would say we've got some pretty complex Maximo Spatial implementations, just complex in the fact of their scope. We can quickly regression test those in a matter of hours, whereas in that circa 2000 type architectural diagram, that same sort of regression testing would probably have taken days to accomplish. So it's really important that you have something like that in place. Also documentation. Documentation is extremely important in the context of communication between the team. At Starboard, we have a common documentation framework that we use for all of our spatial implementations. And our technical folks are familiar with it, our functional folks are familiar with it, and our project managers are comfortable with it or familiar with it. And what that does is it gives all of those folks a common ground when we get together to talk about spatial configuration components. And that common ground with different folks or folks from different areas in their communication streamlines that communication a lot. So we highly recommend that you have something in place, a common communication framework between your organizations, especially when it comes to GIS and Maximo, because generally those are two groups that don't necessarily work together on a daily basis, but will be working together quite a bit when it comes to something like a Maximo spatial implementation. JSON mapping, again, this is something I know you've heard me harp over and over again through the course of the webinar, and I just had to add it in here one more time again. If you're going to take on your Maximo Spatial 7.6 implementation, I highly recommend you spend a lot of time trying to learn all that's capable inside JSON mappings. If you're going to use somebody else to do that, we highly recommend that you make sure that they are very well versed in using JSON mappings for all the capabilities that are available there. And that's only because we've experienced firsthand the power of that and the impact that it has on project schedules, the overall quality of the implementation, and of course that budget that's driving the project implementation as a whole. Finally, automation scripting. automation scripting is your friend. If you're not familiar with automation scripting is an alternative to Java coding inside Maximo. We can actually create JavaScript or Python scripts that run inside Maximo and act just like Java code changes, except we don't need to do all of the stuff that's required with doing Java update or Java development activities. And because of the GIS MBOs, we can actually write automation scripts that are leveraging those GIS MBOs. So we can write automation scripts inside Maximo that are using data that is ultimately housed inside GIS and not replicated inside Maximo. That's something that in earlier implementations would have taken a lot more work and effort to try to accomplish. At Starboard, we've been able to do a lot of direct access to the REST endpoints. So we've actually been able to use automation scripts to interface with REST endpoints in a pragmatic way. So based on whatever the requirements are, whether it be querying the interface for a particular attribute or looking for a particular value, we've been able to write automation scripts that'll do all of that and interact with it just as you would as an end user interacting with the REST interface. And that concludes my slide deck.
That was some great content. Thank you both Butch and Amy. We really appreciate all the presentation and information and tips and tricks. We have a little time left for Q&A, so if you have any questions, please type them below in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we can in the time allowed. But first up, Amy and Butch, if you could, let's start a Q&A. We've had some terrific questions come in.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and there's a lot of really good questions, so we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to address at least some of them, and particularly some of the ones that were more common. There's some themes within the questions that I've noticed. So one of those regarding how to enable Maximo Spatial for other applications. So out of the box by default, you're looking at locations, assets, service addresses, work orders, service requests, labor, I think, things like that, but oftentimes there might be another application that we want to enable. I think how to do that probably could be the subject of its own webinar and then some. There's a lot of detail that goes into that, but Butch, could you maybe give us just kind of the high-level possibilities there?
Oh, most certainly. So it was, I remember, I'll never forget seeing it because being a spatial EM nerd, when the IBM updates come on enhancements and adjustments to the spatial product, I get excited. I'm like a kid on Christmas. And I'll never forget seeing that. But I can't remember which feature pack it was. But IBM has made it so that you can extend your spatially enabled objects outside of what's core. For example, we've heard of organizations that have leveraged and done that with PMs. So they've made PM spatially enabled and allowed that to be part of their spatial flow. So there's a lot of flexibility there as far as kind of what your organization's requiring or from a business requirement standpoint.
All right, great, thank you. Just for confirmation, we had one question. If we understood correctly, Maximo Spatial can consume not only locally deployed ESRI maps, but cloud maps as well via ArcGIS Online?
Yes.
Alrighty. Another question came up related to AGOL. Can you set up a GIS MBO that references an AGOL's hosted features service, just basically having the CRON task reference that hosted service?
Yes. Yep.
When you were talking about the unique identifiers, one of the things that we've found useful there is the global ID, and so there was a question just for confirmation that that is the global ID as defined by ESRI?
Yes, that is the global ID as it is defined by ESRI.
Okay. Another question related to the feature services, is it possible to write GIS data through feature services, and how different is that configuration from a map service?
So if I understand that correctly, I think what is being asked is, can we, if we're configuring so that we creating features in the map tab in Maximo so that those features are then going into GIS. And you follow the same configuration process that you saw here, except you do not do the CRON step. Everything else is the same.
This one is a bit of an interesting one. It's regarding our experience on the Spatial 7602 mapping toolbar. I know we've worked very, very closely with IBM and have opened probably more PMRs than they would have liked, but have a really great long working relationship with the spatial development team on the IBM side. So one of the questions here is, what is our experience on the 7602 mapping toolbar? And if the spatial layer toolbar is active, why the map is taking forever to render. And I suspect there could be a lot of different things going on behind that. So not sure there's a clear answer, but if you want to take a stab at a couple of things maybe.
Sure, no, definitely. So one of the big things that we've found when that's happening is sometimes it may be a network, it could boil down to a network issue between your Maximo environment and your database environment, or anything between both those systems. There's a lot of communication that goes on back and forth from your Maximo Spatial implementation or your Maximo Spatial or Max Map to your GIS environment. And you can also configure the way that that information is communicated. You can actually configure it so that your messages and all your communication is happening from the browser or directly from your server to your GIS database. And of course, you know, anytime you remap traffic, that can have an impact on your overall experience and what your what your expectations are. So I think in circumstances like that, what I tend to recommend, or we tend to recommend, is to try to, if you've got a lot of layers configured, pull a few of those and test it just one-on-one. See if you can identify with a particular layer that might be causing the problem. There's also quite a bit of JavaScript development debug tools that you can use to troubleshoot problems like that. So that would be another thing that you might want to investigate a little bit.
Okay. Another one related to the web maps, is that an either-or alternative?
You know, that's a good question. The way that we've done it so far, it's been either or.
We haven't really had a requirement for somebody that wanted both, I don't believe.
Yeah, no, not that I can recall. But now that you asked that question, I don't know if I've ever seen anything that would stop you. So that's a good question.
Okay. Does Spatial use a recommended coordinate system, or does it matter what you use?
Good question. Webmacator is generally, but it does support other ones. You can use lat long as well as XYs. But you know, when you go back and you start talking again about performance performance considerations, you know, one of the things that ESRIs will always tell you is that the web map coordinate systems are probably going to be your most efficient at rendering maps via the web, which is what you're doing here. So if you can integrate that as part of your process, and especially if you're trying to combat performance-based issues, I would definitely take that into consideration. But a lot of organizations can't do that because of the way that their data is structured. So there are other alternatives as well.
Let's see. This is an interesting one related to redlining, and we run into this quite a bit with our clients. And the question is if it's possible to save redlining done in Maximo as a GIS layer, which would be stored in the GIS database.
When we redlining in the map tab in Maximo saves it as an image, and so the answer to that question is no inside the map in Maximo currently. I'm not exactly sure if the redlining features are stored as a layer on the mobile device or not. So that would be something else that I'd need to go and follow up on. But I know that when you're talking redlining and mobile GIS solutions, that creating those as features so that you can reference them later is a big business requirement. You don't get far in that conversation without that coming up. So I'd be surprised if it wasn't available, or if it wasn't at least on the road or on the radar of IBM's mobile GIS developers.
Okay, great. This one goes back to 7.5 versus 7.6. So back in 7.5 we had the database links. So there's a question about whether or not those database links are still supported in 7.6, or do you have to use the feature services now?
That's a good question. Maximo's maintained a few things from previous versions so that they can be supported going forward. And of course, they're always keeping an eye to that. I think my question would really be why you would want to do that, because moving everything to the feature services really simplifies the process and gives you so much more bang for your buck. I know that it can be difficult, especially if you're an organization that has an existing configuration, and especially if you've extended that initial configuration to maybe embrace going to the feature services going forward. But it's really once you get there, it's an easy transition, and there's a tremendous amount of value. So again, that would be something that you'd really want to sit down and have a conversation and say, okay, what is it about the database link that we really feel like we need to maintain going forward? And maybe you also look at what the feature services provide, and then probably also have a conversation with IBM and make sure that there's that any other kind of features or other kind of things that you want to use inside Maximo, because Spatial is a product that has synergies with other ones like mobile. Make sure there are other products, other features and other products that Spatial would support that you may not be able to use, or maybe not be able to use to the fullest extent because you're still using the database linkages between them. So it's a good question.
And we have had some situations with clients where maybe there was some data in Maximo that was needed, not necessarily by GIS specifically, but by an OMS or SCADA system, and there's been a need to kind of pass that data back and forth. And I know historically that a lot of that was done through data replication, which is still needed in isolated cases, but you can do that through the feature services now. You don't need the data links to do that type of activity. So I think that's a great answer. It definitely goes back to what is the requirement and what are you trying to accomplish. There's a question here. So you talked a little bit about what you would need to do to prep your GIS for Spatial. So there's a question about what's necessary to prep Maximo's data for Spatial. So I guess if we've got some existing locations and assets and we're getting ready to install Spatial, is there anything that's needed on the Maximo side to get those records ready?
I love this question. This is great. Yes, there is one thing. If you're going to be bringing data over from GIS into Maximo, you're going to need to configure on whatever Maximo objects are going to be getting their spatial records, a field on there that will store the unique identifier from GIS. So in the case, I think we talked a little bit about global IDs, but also facility IDs and things like that. In the JSON mapping, I think we talked about the FAC ID and the facility ID and those fields coming together. So FAC ID would be an example of a field that was added to the asset MBO for the main purpose of just storing that value. And there are some good tutorials that IBM and the Spatial group has put together. They've done a wonderful job with the blogs that they've been generating, a wonderful job with sharing a lot of information, but there's a great one that outlines that whole process and talks a little bit about how the best practices in going about and configuring that. But that's the one thing, other than installing Spatial and kind of going through the steps that we talked about here today, that you would need to do.
So speak along the lines of the documentation that's available online. Do you know if there's a white paper available that describes the upgrade process from 7.5 to 7.6? I don't believe we've written one yet. So we do have a lot of Starboard. We have a lot of blog entries about Spatial itself, but I don't know that any are specific to the upgrade. Has IBM released something along those lines?
Nothing that I've seen yet.
Here's another one that has to do with work orders and service requests and just kind of the pros and cons of creating those as a feature on the ArcGIS side versus just storing them in Maximo and basing them on the map based on the related asset or service address. And I think this one probably also goes back to the business requirements and what's needed along those lines, but maybe you can talk to that just a little bit.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Amy. I think having a work order on a map is a powerful thing, or having a feature, and then having that feature on the map with a lot of data behind it is a powerful thing. And initially creating those linkages is a big step, and it's always an eye-opening one for organizations. The next big step is taking that data and bringing the spatial thinking together with the EAM thinking. So how many work orders, show me how many work orders I did for hydrant PM to the month of December quickly on a map. Or show me labor hours for a particular work order type on a map quickly. Or I have a storm event of some sort, and show me inventory breakdowns for work orders on a map and dollar numbers. Those are the kinds of questions when folks are trying to figure out where to put in a new facility or a warehouse, or try to figure out how to strategize their financial situations based off of activities that have occurred. And then make that all, bundle it all together in an extremely powerful medium that gets the point across extremely quick. That's where bringing the EAM systems together with a mapping system really shines. And that's, I guess, really one of the big reasons why I think, not just having work orders out there as flat items inside Maximo, but having them have a spatial component where you can see that on a map, and having that linkage, and then being able to ask questions about that linkage is where things really start to snowball, and it gets very, very interesting very quickly.
All right. We are just about out of time, so I am going to answer one additional set of questions, and it has to do with if there's a demo or preview site available and where you all can get more information. And we're going to take that as an opportunity to promote Starboard a little bit. I don't know that IBM has a published, publicly available demo site that includes spatial. I know they do on some of the VMs. So if you have access to any of IBM's cloud-based solutions, sometimes you can get them through that. But Starboard does. We do have 2 demo sites available. One of them is purely cloud-based. So it's a cloud-based Maximo hooked into an AGOL ArcGIS Online implementation. So it's a cloud-based solution. And then we have an on-premise one as well, which is an on-prem Maximo tied into a local GIS install. So if you do need more information, you want to get with us to do a deeper dive, do a demo, kind of play around with it a little bit more, ask questions, we would be more than happy to get back with you and others in your companies to do more targeted follow-up activities. So with that, we're about out of time. Alex, do you want to take it over from here?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for attending today's presentation. We really appreciate it. Amy and Butch, that was outstanding information. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.